We were just a bunch of dudes that had shaved heads. That's really what it was, you know.
I mean, the main principles were about anti-racism.
Being a skin, you know, being a Baldy, it's American.
There were people that were members, and then there were people that were hangers-on, and then there were people that came later on that just want to be part of the violence.
That was 1987.
Probably in 1988.
Reaganomics, late 80s. Everybody trying to fit in. I mean, when I was a punk, you used to get beat up for that. There's no reason. You're a freak, so people would try to fight you.
Punk scene in the Twin Cities. For many of these teenagers, punk represents the kind of music they enjoy, the way they dress, or even their political views.
I grew up in Detroit, from a working class family, and the politics of your brothers in the union, brothers and sisters in the union, working together for common goals, working against oppression, working against being lied to, being ripped off, and those social justice issues at the time, you know, they were huge, and a lot of it dealt with race and class. I mean, it was just such a traumatic time in this country. You had like Reagan in office, you had this crazy amount of poverty, and then on the other end of that, you had a lot of people that were super rich.
The 1980s, an age of excess where everything was shiny, bright, and plastic. A time when actors became presidents, when the Cold War was in a deep freeze, and the music of the working class and inner city seeped into suburban America. In that music, kids who felt out of place found voices that spoke to them. Almost overnight, American youth were listening to new wave, hip-hop, punk, goth, and alternative. The 1980s, an era of great poverty, political scandal, and public discontent. A decade when the hole in the ozone was discovered, the first domain name registered, and when the Iran-Contra scandal unfolded. A decade in which the art of sensationalized television news and reality TV were polished. Daytime talk shows like Geraldo and Morton Downey Jr. became fodder for bored, stay-at-home moms looking to stay informed. Of the many, often sensationalized subjects covered by these pseudo-news shows, one was skinheads. And more often than not, they covered neo-Nazi skinheads. Geraldo, Phil Donahue, Morton Downey Jr. all had shows where the featured subject was racist skinheads. If I recall correctly, Geraldo Rivera took a chair in the face for that story. What exactly is a skinhead? Are they this, or are they this? Before I tell this story, I need to preface it with a brief history of the skinheads from the 60s until now. The roots of the subculture are found in the flats and watering holes of working-class London in the swinging 60s. Skinhead began as an offshoot of the stylish mod movement, a movement devoted to music, fashion, and most importantly, scooters. Skinheads came on the scene in the late 60s and were made up of working-class whites and Caribbean blacks who gathered to drink, dance, and listen to American soul, R&B, and Jamaican ska and rocksteady. During the 70s and 80s, skinhead grew, and with that growth came oi punk and the two-tone scene. They consider themselves working class and well-dressed. What defined them as a group was their look. Their close-cropped hair, their shaved heads, smart shirts, combat boots, and braces or suspenders. Like the punk movement it became associated with, skinhead gave a middle finger to the austerity of the 50s and the far-out 60s peace and love scene. The clean-cut, working-class look would later be hijacked by white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and racist movements, which was then fed upon by the sharks of the U.S. media machine, who soaked the Nazi skinhead movement for all it was worth, spinning a mostly true story of evil and racism in America.
Because the skinhead movement is built essentially around a special kind of rock and roll music, a kind of rock and roll music that is performed here. And we come on Sunday because Sunday for skinheads is thrash day.
Are the skinheads violent racists or, more innocently, young people in rebellion?
While Prince and Duran Duran blared on radios across the nation, and Ronnie Reagan and George W. Bush Sr. sat in the White House, punk and alternatives spread throughout the country. Many cities became hubs for the counterculture. New York, D.C., Chicago, Boston all had scenes. Other small hubs sprouted up in places like Oklahoma City, Milwaukee, and towns like Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the punk and alternative kids gathered in an area known as Uptown on the south side of Minneapolis. Within that scene was a group of skinheads known as the Baldies, who I knew personally, and this is their story.
I think it was in June 1987. I was in Atlanta hanging out at Little 5 Points. I had met a skinhead that hung around with some skins from St. Paul, and his name was Swamp. This guy was like, he was like a white power skin, but he was really stupid. He had a swastika that was backward on his arm. And like, he was just an idiot, man. So anyway, he told me about these skinheads in Minneapolis.
The Baldies?
Baldies.
The Baldies. I mean, it was a gang in the 50s.
How did you first come to know about the Baldies?
Boy, probably in 1988, I was in Uptown hanging out at McDonald's, and I was with Justin Jagodka, who happened to be hanging out with the White Knights, and I had spent some time with him also. And I had half of my head shaved, kind of in a faux hawk, and I had a skinhead symbol, what I thought was a skinhead symbol at the time, a round circle with the crosshairs, that Justin painted on my jacket, and little did I know some people consider it a white power symbol. So Hugh Malloy had approached myself and Justin, who was wearing an Iron Cross t-shirt, and he wanted to know what we were all about, and let us know in no uncertain terms that folks who were not the Baldies and who called themselves skinheads were not welcome in Uptown if they didn't know who they were. So that was my first taste of the Baldies.
But I remember real vividly this guy named Jason, who's American Indian and was one of the main Baldies. And another guy, I think my cousin Hugh, confronting this Nazi who'd come uptown by himself, this kid that was a white knight. And they basically had set up a policy of anytime they saw one of these Nazis, they'd confront him and ask him if he was a white knight. And then they'd tell him, the next time we see you, if you're still a white knight, you know, you're gonna get your ass kicked. And it actually was a really effective policy because it sort of gave people a moment to think about it and weigh how committed they were to this thing.
The Baldies started because of the white power skins. There were no skin crews here in Minnesota. It was just us. We were just a bunch of friends who liked that culture, you know, and that's how it started. The whole idea of calling ourselves the Baldies was to make it our own, because skinhead is something that people could easily say, oh, you're not English, you're a poser, you know, because skins came from England.
The shaved heads, the polished steel-tipped work boots, the skinhead style.
Obviously, there's already racist people, so I think once skinhead became cool, because it was all over the media, then that's when kids start popping up. You know, oh, I'm a skinhead now. Then they run into us, and then they're like, oh, we don't like those dudes because we get beat up. I mean, we beat up so many different dudes from Milwaukee that would come wandering around, you know, trying to talk shit and get beat down. The main guy who started the White Knights, we used to hang out with that dude before he went white power or got retarded. I don't know what his problem was. Anybody who knows anything about skinheads is they're violent, straight up and down. There's no, like, it's the whole point, the look, you know, it's like, yeah, these dudes are ready to go. It's like a pack of wolves, you know, it's like you want to feed the frenzy, you know, it's like you're stupid. There's a lot of times we're at parties and it was always some dude grabbing on some girl we knew, and that's, you know, them dudes would get a beat down because we had a posse, so it was like the Baldies, and then it was like all of our friends and brothers and cousins, so then that just made it crazy.
Oh, it was pretty diverse. We had Native American skins, we had skins that were black, white, Asian.
Rich kids, poor kids, you know, middle class, black, whites, Indians, Asians, everybody, women.
At its peak, including everybody, it might have been at one point up to like 50 at its peak.
Maybe 80, between 50 and 80.
Its core was always more around like a dozen to 15, I would say. You know, people that saw each other every weekend and were always doing stuff together and running around together.
We rallied from what we knew was from our inner city neighborhoods. So we got kids from the skate crews. We got kids from the gangs, we got kids that were break dancers and kids that were graffiti artists. We had a message that we were going to stand for, our message, whether it came verbally or in print, or we had to stand our ground with boots and fists. I think you kind of had to earn your bones that way, that you needed to be intelligent, be able to carry a message as well as to back it up with your fists if you needed to.
We used to get hate mail sent to ARA, you know, from the Klan, from war, from all these dudes. We're gonna kill you. Well, hey, we're right here, dude. We're uptown every weekend. Come on through.
But not all skinheads are racist and violent young rebels.
There was like so much violence. That part was just, you know, I regret some of those things.
This is probably 1990, and we were getting up. It was back in the day when they had warehouse parties. We were walking up the steps, and all of a sudden I see these boots, this row of boots, and I'm like, oh, maybe so. Oh, we get up, it's white T-shirts and then white power shirts, and they're like, oh, here are the nigger lovers. Great. So I was carrying what we called a stone on bone, which was a 8-ball, not a crack cocaine 8-ball, but an 8-ball from a pool table in a sock, and we wrapped it in duct tape. And so one of the guys kicked me in the face and knocked me down the stairs, and as I'm falling back, you know, I'm trying to swing this thing back and forth, and a couple guys from the other side, you know, we were in close proximity and we were fighting, and somebody with me takes out a straight razor and starts cutting, and I just remember seeing blood everywhere, and you know, like guts and just the real fucking deal. And a couple other guys got hurt really bad, and the guy that got hurt was a person that I knew from back then, and you know, it's one of those things of being with the wrong crowd at the wrong time. But looking back, I have a lot of regret about how that happened, you know. I think we were really defending ourselves, but I've had a chance to talk to this person since, and he's actually a friend of mine now.
Yeah, I think there was some white power dude was at the U doing his thing on the radio and all this other crap, and I think some people went over there and something went down, and that's when like Kieran and Mills got into some stuff, and then I think Kieran had a big long legal battle with that.
Anytime they saw one of these Nazis, they'd confront him and ask him if he was a white knight, and then they'd tell him, the next time we see you, if you're still a white knight, you know, you're gonna get your ass kicked. And it actually was a really effective policy. It also sort of set boundaries too, like, you know, people realized they weren't going to be able to come uptown, or they weren't going to be able to go to First Avenue, which were like the two big youth hangouts, like alternative scene hangouts or whatever. So a bunch of them actually quit, you know, and some of them even became baldies, and it caused the white knights to fall apart, you know, with only a few fights, really.
There were people that were members, and then there were people that were hangers-on, and then there were people that came later on that just want to be part of the violence.
I mean, it turned into its own monster to a certain point, you know. So I mean, I started working on the weekends, and I was later on, you know, so I wasn't around as much, but it was just, I mean, the same thing, you know, fighting. And got to the point where it seemed like we couldn't go to any parties. Everybody's like, oh, don't let these dudes in, man. Shit's gonna go down, you know. You're kind of on edge, and you're like, whatever, dude, I got my steel toes on, I'm ready to go. For some kids, it got pretty hardcore. I mean, like, I remember one time one guy, we're all hanging out in the corner like we always did. The cops pulled up, grabbed him out of everybody, you know, they just randomly grabbed somebody, threw him in a cop car, and we're all sitting there like, what the hell, you know? And then he gets out, and he's like freaked out looking. And we're like, well, I don't know, what'd they say? Oh, you're fucking with the biggest gang in Minneapolis Police Department. You know, so I mean, that shit went down a lot. You know, they would randomly grab people if they could and assault them. So let alone you had the authority figure too trying to beat us down. I remember biking home, and you know, there'd be one cop car here, another one behind me. Pull up to my house, there'd be a cop down the street, and I'm like, really? They're really that? I mean, now I can't even imagine what it'd be like now. They'd be tapping everybody's shit. you know, but I mean, for back then, it was still pretty crazy. But I mean, we didn't really have nothing to hide. It's not like had some hidden agenda.
Baldy's Righteous Acts of Violence organization. And so what we would do is that we would, people that were reactionary in their views, like people that were racist, because I believe racists are really reactionary, and there's no thought out plan except for terror, you know, for them. And we felt like the only thing that they understood was terror. And so what we would do, we made a list of people. I don't think it was ever written down, but maybe it was exchanged verbally. And so we had a list of people, and we would hunt them down, and that's how you got on the list, and we would come get you. We became so self-destructive that we started to eat up anyone that wasn't like us. And it was sad because a lot of people that we did this to weren't even racist, you know, and then shared some of our political views, but we pushed them back so much that, you know, we became a scene to ourselves, you know. I mean, we at one point didn't even spend time with punk rockers in our community. And it, you know, we were like, we didn't need them. If they weren't with us, then they were against us, so. I regret that.
The year was 1987. The crack epidemic was in full swing. Wall Street crashed on Black Monday while notorious Nazi Klaus Barbie was sentenced to life in prison. Back in Minneapolis, the Baldies began to grow in number and evolve. And with the new and diverse members came the growing pains of having a larger group. They decided they needed to discuss the future, to expand their political stance, and be more inclusive. And after a few initial conversations, the Baldies and their many affiliates held court at an uptown pizza joint named Rocky Rococo's.
Like a lot of good things, it started in a pizza parlor. There was used to be a Rocky Rococo's pizza place. One of the Baldies worked in there, so we'd always go in there. And so it became a little meeting place, a place to hook up, especially in the wintertime, because when you're committed to hanging out every weekend, even in Minnesota winters, it's like you got to get off the corner and find a place inside. So they were always chasing us out of there, but we'd hang out in there a lot. We'd come up with this idea that we needed to get the whole fight against the Nazis and against racism beyond just skinheads. And we wanted to include other people in it and wanted it to be more explicitly political. And so we had a meeting to try and set up something like that. And the initial idea was that it was going to be a coalition, that the Baldies would be one member of it, but we would try and get Mental Madness Posse to be a part of it, but also maybe like activist groups, like there was a student organization called PSO, and there was an anarchist group called Rabble. It mostly ended up being sort of like the Baldies political group, is how it ran for a number of years anyways. So we had a meeting in this pizza place and talked about the ideas about how we would do it, how we'd organize it, you know, what the name was going to be and stuff like that, and that's how it started.
I've been organizing against Nazis and white supremacists since 1985, when I was a founding member of ARA in Minneapolis. And ARA is Anti-Racist Action, that's what it stands for. I'm no longer a member of ARA, but the reason we came up with the name ARA is because every day I exist in anti-racist action. For the simple fact that I'm a descendant of people that were stolen from the continent of Africa and brought here to this country.
When it came to ARA is that we didn't organize just amongst skinheads. We organized all the people that were going to be affected in those neighborhoods of those guys trying to stir up trouble and start violence. And if we really wanted to do a serious youth movement, that you don't get involved just skinheads. You get involved the entire culture of oppressed people.
The main thrust of it definitely was to organize to fight against the Nazis. And we'd kicked them out of Minneapolis basically. But we knew that they were reorganizing in St. Paul and had a big front there. But we also wanted to get involved in other struggles around police brutality and against sexism, especially because a lot of the women in the group had become more conscious of like feminist politics, and some of the men too. A big part of it was about action. We always did education stuff, put out literature, put on shows, that kind of stuff. But a big part of it was like action, and a whole run a gamut of different stuff, like from confronting Nazi skinheads where they tried to organize, to organizing demonstrations to try and shut down neo-Nazi concerts or their headquarters, to confronting the Ku Klux Klan when they tried to organize, to trying to defend abortion clinics from Christian fascists trying to shut them down. And so like most all of it would be something we call direct action, and that means, again, not waiting to get a permit from City Hall in order to have a march, not waiting for, not just doing things symbolically like sitting down and waiting to get arrested, but actually if you want to try and shut something down, that means getting enough people that you can block the thing from happening. And you know, sometimes that involves people being ready to throw down and fight, and other times it means just having the numbers where the other side can sum it up and decide it isn't worth it, and then you know, you don't have to fight. And that's kind of like, one time in St. Paul we did that with a Nazi show where we were able to take over the park where we knew that they were using as a meet point. Yeah, they tried to keep that secret, where the space was where they're gonna have the show, so they had the Nazis who were wanting to come to the show come to a meet point where they would get instructions on how to get to the show. And ARA found out both where the meet point was and where the concert was going to be held. And so we had like an anti-racist barbecue with softball, which meant we had a lot of baseball bats. We had close to 100 people occupy this park, and so every time a Nazi came through looking for where to pick up directions, you know, they would get chased out pretty quick. They weren't able to ever consolidate the group of people to come to the show. And then we leafleted in the neighborhood where the show was going to be on the west side of St. Paul, which is like a particular neighborhood was like a mixed white and Mexican area. And a whole bunch of people from the neighborhood, as well as people we had brought, came out and surrounded the space. The Nazis weren't able to get their numbers there because of the park thing, and then basically the police and authorities saw this, what looked to them could be a potential riot, and community people and militant activists out there, that they decided it wasn't worth it, and the police made the Nazis, you know, cancel their show. And so, but that happened without really any fighting in particular. It was just getting the numbers out that were willing to do what it took.
They did a lot of editorials on us, like nightly news, and we were involved even before the City Pages article came out.
According to subculturist.com, between 1986 and 1991, American skinheads were the subject of more than 50 national magazine articles, at least a dozen commissioned reports by anti-racist associations, one FBI monograph, numerous television programs, and 2 Hollywood movies.
The City Page article was a really huge jumping off point, I think, for us. And then, you know, we were always in fanzines. I know we had a little blurb in Rolling Stone, which I really don't, I really don't care about that, but at the time, to not have all the communication, Twitter, Facebook, all that, you know, a lot of the sitting down interviewing people or writing stories, that's how we kind of got big, and it's pretty amazing considering, you know. I'm glad they didn't have handheld cameras back then. I'd be in prison probably of that.
When we first got known, there was like an interview in an article in Maximum Rock and Roll, which was a big punk newspaper at the time, still is, and so we started getting all these letters.
We used to get hate mail sent to ARA, you know, from the Klan, from war, from all these dudes. We're gonna kill you.
Like, we didn't answer mail. We, you know, we were just fucking bums when you look back on it. So, but things happened anyways. You know, people organized and got crews together to fight Nazi skinheads in their own other cities, and the ones that we met with, especially, started taking on the name ARA.
It's amazing how ARA just took off. Because at first, it floundered big time. You know, we'd get these kids coming that wanted to do something. Then every time shit would go down, they're like looking at us like, can you help us? It's like, dude, come on, man. You gotta learn how to fight. This isn't, these Nazis aren't, you know, they're gonna kick your ass. If they know you're a punk, they're for sure gonna beat you down. They didn't wanna fight us, you know. They wanna go after these ARA kids because they're, you know, they don't have a reputation. And then if you're used to fighting with someone, you know, you don't have to worry about them. I don't have to worry about this guy because I know he can fight. With all these other cats, you don't know. You're like looking around, trying to figure out, do I have to cover that, you know? Yeah. So I think that puts people off too, because they don't want to get hurt.
So the first kind of thing that got going out of that was sort of a crew of like anti-racist skinhead crews called the Syndicate, several of which called themselves ARA. And that was mostly Midwest groups, Milwaukee, Chicago, Minneapolis. And those were probably the 3 big ones, but also Cincinnati was part of it, Lawrence, Kansas. That sort of, after a period too, fell apart. And so ARA got reorganized on a more sort of like political basis without being based around the skinheads. seen so much. So there's always been anti-racist skinheads involved in it too. And it grew again, and at its height in the early 90s, or mid-90s, there was like over 100 chapters all across the U.S.
In 2018, the anti-racist action movement perseveres, and in some cases is now known as Antifa. Nearly everywhere there is racism, they are there to oppose it. One would think that these toxic mentalities of racism and xenophobia would have been trains of thought long lost to history. The sad reality is quite the contrary. In Europe, the Mideast refugee crisis draws nationalistic fervor, while on the streets of Greece, Spain, and Poland, fascism has regained its footing. In the U.S., Republican president and notorious reality TV star Donald Trump, while campaigning, whipped the ignorant, discontented masses into a frenzy, blaming Mexican immigrants for the loss of jobs and a rise in crime.
I love the Mexican people. 2 waiters came up to me tonight. Mr. Trump, we love you. I said, where are you from? Mexico. I said, that's great, I love you too.
Trump is actively making a concerted effort to deport en masse all undocumented migrants, with a focus on Muslims and Mexicans.
White supremacists organizing in the city and the country is not a surprise. You know, since I was a shorty in the Midwest, I basically saw the direction this country was headed. I saw the different things that have happened in the past in the history of the globe that we're bound to repeat in this society, in this current civilization. So fuck Nazis.
I was born in the United States, not some guy just to be